was Harriet Tubman? By Yona Zeldis McDonough. Who was Harriet Tubman? No one knows the exact year in which Harriet Tubman was born. It may have been 1820 or 1821. Almost everyone thought the birth of a slave baby wasn't worth remembering. Born a slave, Harriet Tubman grew into a brave and daring young woman. She was brave enough to escape from slavery. She was daring enough to help others escape, too. Because she led so many to freedom, she was called Moses. Like Moses in the Bible, Harriet Tubman believed that her people should be free. And she risked her life many times to help them become free. Even after she had escaped safely from the South, she went back to take other slaves north to freedom. Here is her story. Chapter 1, Life in Maryland. Sometime around 1820 in Maryland, a slave named Harriet Ross had a baby girl. Neither Harriet, who was called Old Rit, nor her husband, Ben, could read or write, so they couldn't record the year of the baby's birth. No one else thought it was worth doing. But Old Rit loved her tiny child and wanted to protect her. She hoped her little girl, whose nickname was Minty, would learn to sew, cook, or weave. Then she could be a house slave and avoid the backbreaking work picking crops like tobacco, corn, or wheat in the fields. Old Rit and Ben had been born slaves. They had many children, all of whom were slaves, too. Black people had been slaves in the United States for a long time. Ever since 1619, when blacks from Africa were kidnapped and brought on slave ships to Virginia, slavery had been a part of American life. By the early 1800s, most of the northern states had stopped slavery. But the southern states had not. Slaves like Ben and Old Rit worked very hard, yet they were not paid for their work. Instead, Ben and Old Rit lived on land owned by their master, a man named Mr. Brodas. This land and the many buildings on it was called a plantation. Mr. Broda's plantation house was large and grand, like so many of those in the South. Ben and Old Rit could see the Broda's big house every day, but they didn't live there. They lived in a log cabin, like the other slaves on the plantation. Slaves' cabins were very small. They had no windows. The floors were made of dirt. Piles of worn-out blankets were the only beds. Still, for little Minty, this was home and she loved it. As soon as she could walk, Minty joined her brothers and sisters and other slave children who were watched by an older slave. The littlest children ran and played naked. The older ones wore a coarse linen garment. None of them wore shoes. Still, they had fun. Summers were warm and bright. They swam and fished in the many streams and creeks. Even though she was a slave, Minty was happy. She loved her parents. Ben, her father, told her stories about the woods. He could name the birds. He knew which berries were sweet and tasty. Bought and sold. Slaves brought to the United States from Africa were sold at auction to the person who bid the highest amount of money for them. Groups of black men, women, and children were brought together for this purpose. Auctions were advertised with signs and newspaper ads. White people came beforehand to look over the slaves. They pried open their mouths to check their teeth. They pinched their arms and legs to test their muscles. Even worse was the way an auction could tear apart a family. A mother might be sold to a plantation owner in Mississippi while her son or daughter might be sold to a plantation owner in Louisiana. The two would never see each other again. Husbands and wives, parents and children, brothers and sisters were cruelly separated. In 1859, a plantation owner named Pierce M. Butler sold 436 slaves to pay off money he owed. It was the largest slave auction on record in the United States and it was called the Weeping Time. The slaves, all of whom were born on Butler's plantations, were brought to a racetrack in Savannah, Georgia. They were put in stalls meant for horses while they waited for the auction to begin. By the end of the two-day event, all of the slaves were sold away from the only home they had ever known. They would never see their family or friends again. Minty's mother told her stories from the Bible. From her mother, Minty learned about Moses. Moses had lived thousands of years before. He led his people, the Hebrews, out of Egypt, where they had been slaves, and into freedom. Around 1826, when Minty turned 6, her life changed. Mr. Brodas hired her out. This meant that she had to leave her parents and her home. She had to go live and work for white people who could not afford to buy a slave of their own. The day she had to leave, a wagon came to take her away. Minty did not want to go. Her 2 older sisters had been taken away. She remembered how they cried and cried. But they had to go anyway. So did Minty. Minty worked for a woman named Mrs. Cook. Mrs. Cook was a weaver. She spent her days in front of a big, noisy loom. Minty helped her wind the yarn. The air was filled with fuzz and lint. It made Minty cough. She dropped the yarn. She couldn't concentrate. Mrs. Cook got angry. When she was angry, she would punish Minty by whipping her. Slaves were whipped often. That was how the masters made them behave. Mrs. Cook told her husband that Minty was stupid and slow. So Mr. Cook had her help him instead. He was trying to catch muskrats. He set out traps by the river. It was Minty's job to watch them. It was cold near the river, but it was quiet, too. The air was clear and fresh. One day Minty woke up feeling sick. Mrs. Cook thought she was pretending so she wouldn't have to work. Just as always, Mr. Cook sent Minty out to check the traps. She went down to the river, shivering from fever. When she got back, Mrs. Cook saw that she was really sick. She sent Minty home to her parents to get well. Old Rit took care of Minty for 6 weeks. But then it was back to Mrs. Cook and the loom. Minty could not learn to do the job. The cooks sent her home again. Next, Mr. Brodas hired Minty out to a woman named Miss Susan. Minty, who was only about 7, had to watch Miss Susan's baby. If the baby cried, Minty was whipped. At night she sat by the baby's cradle. She rocked it gently. But Minty was tired. She would fall asleep and the baby would begin to cry. Then Miss Susan would get angry at being woken, and Minty was whipped again. Minty learned to stay alert for the baby, but it was hard. She was always tired. Once, when Miss Susan's back was turned, Minty reached for a lump of sugar that was in a bowl on the table. She had never tasted sugar. Slaves were rarely given candy or treats. It looked so good. But Miss Susan saw her. Furious, she reached for the whip. Minty was too fast. Out the door she flew. She did not stop running until she was sure Miss Susan was no longer chasing her. But now what? If she went back, she would face a whipping. Minty found a pig pen. She crawled inside to hide. She was very young, but she was bold. She tried to fight the piglets for potato peelings and other scraps of food. But the mother pig pushed Minty away. After 5 days, Minty was filthy and starving. She knew she would have to return to her mistress. Later Minty would say, "I didn't have anywhere else to go, even though I knew what was coming." Nat Turner's Rebellion. Born around 1800, Nat Turner was a slave in Southampton County, Virginia. When he was little, his mother told him that he would one day lead his people to freedom, like Moses in the Bible. She had memorized verses and whole chapters of the Bible, and she taught them to her son. Turner grew up to be a preacher. Other slaves called him the prophet, which means teacher. He was a silent, moody man who spent a lot of time alone. Turner believed what his mother had told him, that he had been chosen to lead his fellow slaves to freedom. In 1828, Turner announced that there would be a certain sign letting him know it was time to rebel. On August 20, 1831, there was an eclipse of the sun. Turner thought that was the sign. He led a band of slaves from plantation to Plantation, killing the whites they met. Wherever they stopped, more slaves joined them. Soon, there were 70 slaves who killed 60 white people in all. The rebellion was broken up with the help of federal troops. 100 blacks were killed putting down the rebellion. But Turner was not among them. He stayed hidden in a cave for 2 months. Later he was found, and on November 11, 1831, Nat Turner was executed. Instead of being hired out again, Minty was sent back to Mr. Broda's. Now Minty had to work in the fields, which was very hard. She split logs, loaded wood onto wagons, worked the plow, and drove oxen. Minty had grown strong and sturdy. She could do the jobs. And when she was in the fields, she could see the sky and feel the wind. The other slaves talked while they worked. That was how Minty began to hear new ideas. She heard slaves who said they wanted to be free. Some of them escaped from the plantation. They went north, to freedom. Others, like Nat Turner, started rebellions to end slavery. Nat Turner was caught and killed. But his ideas didn't die. More and more, slaves thought about being free. Late one day in 1834, Mr. Broda's slaves gathered with the slaves from another plantation to shuck the corn. They sang while they worked, peeling the pale green husks from the golden ears of corn. One slave stood apart. Minty watched him. He began moving across the big field. At first the overseer, the man who kept the slaves in line, didn't notice. The slave was halfway across when the overseer saw him. He shouted for him to return. The man kept going. The overseer followed, holding his big whip. Minty followed, too. The overseer was running now, chasing the escaped slave. The slave ducked into a store. The overseer ran after him. The slave was cornered in the store. The overseer called to Minty. He wanted her to help him tie up the runaway slave. But Minty didn't move. She stood watching the two men. Suddenly, the slave pushed past the overseer and was out of the store. Gone. As for Minty, she blocked the doorway, so the overseer couldn't follow the slave. The overseer picked up a heavy, 2-pound weight and threw it at the runaway. The weight missed the runaway slave, but it hit Minty on the forehead. She fell, unconscious and bleeding. She was brought to old Rit, who nursed her tenderly. No one thought Minty would live. Still, old Rit cared for her daughter night and day. Eventually, Minty recovered from the wound, though it left a scar on her forehead. It wasn't just the scar that made Minty different now. People treated her with respect. Although she was only 13 or 14, she had defied an overseer. No longer was she called by her childhood name of Minty. Instead, she was called Harriet, her mother's name. Clearly, she was not a child anymore. Chapter 2, Looking for the North Star. Harriet was not the same after she got well. She suffered from headaches. Sometimes she had sleeping spells. One minute she might be awake and talking. The next, she would be sound asleep. The spells frightened her. She heard a rumor. Mr. Broda's, her master, was going to sell her. He would sell some of her brothers, too. What would happen to her? She might be sent farther south, to New Orleans, Louisiana, or Natchez, Mississippi, in a chain gang. In a chain gang, the slaves were chained together at the ankles to prevent their escape. The trip south would be long and hard. If Harriet fell asleep in the road, the overseer would whip her. He might whip her very hard and leave her to die. Her brothers would not be able to save her. Even if she could survive the trip, Harriet knew that being sold someplace farther south was a bad thing. That was where so many of the cotton plantations were. Cotton and tobacco. Plantation owners in the South grew many different kinds of crops, which they could sell for money. Two of the most popular were cotton and tobacco. Hawn cotton was used for cloth and clothing. The plantation owners needed many workers to plant and pick the cotton. First, the slaves had to pick the little balls of cotton from the cotton plants. Then they had to clean the cotton balls to make them ready for spinning. Slaves toiled long and hard to do this back-breaking job. Tobacco was another commonly grown crop. Slaves were also used to plant and pick tobacco. The owners of the big plantations knew that without slaves working for them, they would not be able to grow the crops that brought in their money. They told themselves that slavery was all right, because they needed the work heirs. But the wealth enjoyed by the plantation owners was made from the blood and sweat of the slaves who worked for them. Working in the cotton fields was very hard work. Also, going farther south meant she would be further from the northern states. Further from freedom. Harriet did not want to be a slave all her life. She wanted desperately to be free. Harriet began to pray that Mr. Broaddus would die. To her amazement, he did get sick and died soon after. And Harriet found that she was sorry. She believed it was wrong to have prayed for his death. But now she had a new owner who was more fair. His name was Dr. Anthony Thompson. Dr. Thompson hired Harriet and her father out to a builder named John Stewart. At first she swept, dusted, washed clothes, and made the beds in Mr. Stewart's house. But she hated the work and asked if she could work outside with the men. Mr. Stewart agreed. Harriet worked alongside the men, cutting down trees and splitting logs. She was a good worker. Sometimes Mr. Stewart let her take other jobs. She even earned some money for her work. She had to give Mr. Stewart part of the money, but she could keep some of it. Harriet looked for more outdoor work, hauling logs, driving an ox cart, plowing fields. Harriet worked 5 years for the builder. She became even stronger and more capable. She was more than 21 years old now, all grown up. Her father kept teaching her things, too. He taught her to move through the woods without making a sound. He showed her how to find the North Star, near the Big Dipper. The North Star was a guiding light for slaves. It showed the North the way to freedom. Ben told his daughter that, with the North Star in sight, you would know you were headed in the right direction. But what if there were cloudy nights and the stars were hidden? Ben told his daughter to feel the trees for moss. Moss grew only on the north sides of trees. Even without the North Star, the moss could help a traveler. Harriet listened to what her father had to say. She remembered his words. In time, they would help her. Chapter 3, A Free Man's Wife. In 1844, when she was about 23, Harriet fell in love with John Tubman. John's parents had been slaves. But their master freed his slaves at the time of his death, so John was born free. John and Harriet made plans to marry. Harriet began making a quilt. She sewed it from different scraps of cloth. Sewing was hard work. She wasn't used to holding the needle. It was so small. Again and again, she dropped it. It was hard to find a needle on the dirt floor. Still, she kept working until the quilt was done. The finished quilt had many colors: yellow, purple, white, and green. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. When she married John and went to live in his cabin, she took the quilt with her. John was happy with their life. He loved Harriet and liked the money she made. They had a cabin of their own. Life was good. But Harriet was not so content. What if her new owner wanted to sell her? She and John would be separated. She still thought about escaping. She begged John to go north with her. They would follow the North Star. In the north, Harriet would be a free woman. They would both be free. John did not want to leave home. It was too dangerous. What would they eat? How would they? Abolitionists. Abolitionists were 18th and 19th century reformers who believed slavery was evil and wanted to end or abolish it. Unlike other anti-slavery supporters who worked towards a gradual end of slavery, abolitionists called for slavery to end immediately. Although the Quakers had long opposed slavery, abolitionists were not just Quakers, but people of other religions as well. The abolitionist movement started in 1780, in England, when William Wilberforce and his followers spoke out against the African slave trade. The American abolitionist movement began in 1831, when William Lloyd Garrison started The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper, in Boston. Other abolitionist newspapers and books followed. But it was not until after the Civil War ended